Hajime, welcome back to Comic-Jutsu. JT McRoberts here with you, producer, writer, illustrator, creator of Tales from Mutantville, Mutish's Movie Morgue, and The Movie Goddess. Well, co-creator, at least, with my partners at Mutantville. Of course, you can see some of my horror efforts here behind me, available some pieces on YouTube and other places via Amazon streaming. You can check out Ghosts, Tales from Mutantville, all that good stuff. Today I thought we'd do something just a little bit different. I'm always getting a lot of feedback about storytelling advice, and to me, that's a really nebulous question with a multiplicity of answers. It really just depends on where you are as an individual, or where we are as individual creators in terms of our development as storytellers. You know, we may need more of an understanding of just like basic structure, 1 act, 2 act, 3 acts, 5 act structures, what have you. Or one may need a better understanding of just like a basic script, such as a movie script or a comic book script. Or if one is wanting to script for comic books and sequential illustration specifically, you want to understand how that translates into comic art. So there's different advice for a lot of different approaches. It just depends on you. So the more feedback I get on the channel, the more specific I can get about some of my answers. But one of the things I really like to do is I like to watch, number one, I like to watch great stories, whether it's great films or great television shows. For example, through the Halloween season, I like to go back and revisit like classic Twilight Zone episodes, or the Outer Limits episodes, or maybe even like spooky episodes of Star Trek, or Tales from the Crypt, Tales from the Dark Side, Monsters. Maybe in recent years something like American Horror Story, but the storytelling in that is very, very different in that they use a compressed style, so I don't glean as much from it as one could get from like just a good tight Twilight Zone episode. Where you've got a good beginning, a middle, and an end. You've got a protagonist. Sometimes you have some kind of antagonistic force. Problems are presented. They deal with it. There are complications. They overcome it, or they succumb to it. Something along those lines. Another thing that I like to do is to also look at the critics, see what the critics are saying, whether it's about contemporary works or from something of the past. And one of my favorite films in a series of my favorite films is the George A. Romero Dead trilogies, because there are now kind of 2 of them that are kind of their own separate little entities, though I guess the original is kind of a quadrilogy, though that's not a real word. But anyway, we'll keep things moving along. One of my favorite things is to look at critics when I think that they were just really wrong. When something came out during the time period in which they were covering films, and they commented on it, and in a lot of ways they just weren't ready for it, especially if it's something that's kind of ahead of the curve, or it's in terms of horror, if it's just darker and kind of nastier than anything that's come before it. That's the difficulty with making horror films and telling scary stories, is that you run the risk of alienating audiences or critics or what have you when you push the envelope too much. So I thought, you know what? Let's go back and take a look at the classic review for George A. Romero's Day of the Dead, released 1985. It was a highly misunderstood film, but talked about by Siskel and Ebert. Let me go ahead and mute them while we're queuing them up. I really enjoyed Siskel and Ebert growing up. Watched the guys every Saturday. In the pre-internet age, it was the only way to get to see a chunk of movie trailers and actual, scenes from the film, and to get just immediate feedback. Like a movie would be scheduled for release like Thursday, Friday of that coming weekend, and they would talk about it the week before. I'm trying to remember the exact timing of it, or did they talk about it the week that it was actually released? It might have been that, but I'm thinking it was the week before. But anyway, so long ago. I'm reaching back through the depths there. Gene Siskel almost always hated horror films. Roger Ebert sometimes understood them. Yeah, Roger Ebert's sole writing credit being Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which is pretty fantastic cult film, I must say. But Gene Siskel, he always kind of had his own standards that he thought films should fall into, and he never really understood the art of getting into actual horror films. You know, to him, he didn't appreciate them as horror films. He always wanted to compare them to high art. They don't always fall into that category. I mean, there are, you know, horror films that take themselves serious in that kind of way, like maybe something like Robert Wise's The Haunting, or like in recent years, you know, The Witch, or, you know, films like that, or Midsommar, or at this time, the time of this release, you know, something like The Shining, you know, things that they want to be art, but they want to be horrific tales of gruesome terror. And in this particular review, these guys really show that they just don't understand these films at all.
Based on the John D. McDonald novel.
Let's listen to what they say.
Roger begins with the latest sequel in a series of grisly horror films.
Our first movie is the third in a series by director George Romero that began back in 1967 with a low-budget cult film, Night of the Living Dead.
Now, you notice Roger Ebert, he glosses completely over that. He reviewed Night of the Living Dead, and he lambasted it at the time as being excessive and gory for no reason and all of these things. So he just skips right over the fact that he was totally myopic about the seminal horror film of modern horror filmmaking. When we talk about George Romero, that's what we talk about. Now, I'm sorry if this sounds pretentious or whatever, but if we're going to talk storytelling, we're going to talk about these kind of things at times. So let's just shoot some ideas back and forth, okay? Romero really gave birth to the modern horror film with Night of the Living Dead. It was so far ahead of its time, you know, Roger Ebert just, he completely missed the boat on it. He complained about children being there to watch it. I mean, I guess it depends on what your expectations are going into it. That was not a Saturday matinee spooky thriller for kids to watch. You know, they need to stick to the Mickey Mouse, you know, haunted house type stuff. If kids are going to be involved, you know, horror films should be for teens or young adults or adults and older folks like us now, us old heads. But he glosses over the fact that he completely missed the boat on Night of the Living Dead. They got on board for Dawn of the Dead because they saw kind of this metaphor or allegory that was being used in it, and they were okay with that, you know, the social commentary and whatnot. But then they come back to Day of the Dead, and they don't know how to approach this film.
That movie told the story of a race of ghouls that had inhabited the earth and were devoting their lives, or maybe I should say their deaths, to lurching around and eating large chunks of healthy living human beings. The first movie was followed in 1980 by Dawn of the Dead, and now comes Day of the Dead. It continues.
Why does he say Dawn of the Dead came out in 1980? What is that about? It came out in 1978. I mean, that's not confusing. I mean, I think it was released in Italy in 1980 maybe. But why does he say 1980? That's Bizarro World.
Here's the story as a small band of survivors huddle in an underground storage area beneath Florida and try to perform experiments on captive ghouls. In this scene, there is growing tension between the scientists and military men.
What are you talking about, me?
I'll just pause it very briefly. He does call them ghouls, which is actually on brand because Romero originally referred to his zombies as ghouls before popular culture took over and started calling them zombies. So at least Ebert gives him that much respect. He says it's about ghouls.
Make them behave. What does that mean?
It means keeping them from wanting to eat us, for one thing. It means keeping them in check. It means controlling them. Controlling them.
When are you going to show us something that we can understand?
Very close, very close. I think in a matter of weeks.
I don't think there's any way you can tell how long anything is going to take. It could be months, it could be years before we know exactly what we're dealing with here.
Sarah's research is more esoteric than mine. She's looking for a way to reverse the process, a way to eradicate the problem. Could take a long time, a very long time. She may never find what she's looking for.
Now, I'm surprised these guys did not immediately glom onto the strong female protagonist. I mean, this, you know, here we are, the age of female empowerment, you know, more so than ever. But, you know, at the time where you had big, you know, hard body, muscly, baloney coated action heroes dominating the film scene, it was very, very rare to have a female lead in what's essentially still an action adventure type film, even though this is a horror film. But she is the protagonist, and she's sympathetic, she's proactive, all the good things that you'd want from your lead character. And it's a good performance by Lori Cardille. In some ways, a little wistful and thoughtful and seemingly introspective. But in some ways, the critics ask for restraint on this film, but then they don't appreciate it when they see it right in front of them.
That scientist's nickname is Frankenstein. He's learned to train the ghouls to do simple tasks like this good student he calls Bub.
Now, how do these guys, they praise the whole notion of zombies in a shopping mall? Like, oh, it's a comment on consumerism. They're going to completely miss the... now, yeah, it's heavy-handed. It's heavy-handed commentary on the military and the culture of military brainwashing that we live in as a society, whether it's here in America or in places abroad, but especially here in America, where we're all guns all the time, all the way. Yo, Joe, which I'm a patriotic individual myself, but we have to see the shortcomings and failings in some of those attitudes. And here they completely miss the subtext of, remember, in Romero's films, the zombies are us. So here we are. We're being brainwashed to pick up guns and shoot each other.
It's empty, Captain. We saw the bullets come out. Let's see what he does. Let's see what Bub does in this situation.
Bub is a real quick student. He has a lot of fun, too, with a Sony Walkman, which he enjoys.
This is very good because you would want to train Bub, of course, to learn how to shoot a gun. That would be very important.
That's one of those scenes where when you see it in the movie, you can bet your entire paycheck that by the end of the movie, Bub's going to have a gun that does have bullets in it.
Okay, so both the guys, again, they just completely missed the subtext of this. The zombies are us. We're being brainwashed to kill each other. And I don't know how they do that. They pick up, there's a little nod towards consumerism with the Walkman, you know, but they're taking this so literally. They literally they cannot see the forest for the trees. That they're missing the subtext that is at play in the film. Now, mind you, I'm sure there's some keyboard clacker out there. Oh, you're just projecting all this into... Well, that's what one does with art, with film, with stories, is we project into it. What do we glean from it? So if I'm going to talk about it, I've got to tell you about the things that I see in this. But here they're not giving the film credit for what it is actually doing, on top of just completely ignoring the fantastic scenery chewing going on by the late great Joe Pilato, the great supporting roles by the other actors, like the guys playing Terry and whatnot. Just fantastic, just over the top stuff, and it's the purview of B movies. I mean, it's a cheesy, simple plot, but there's this ham-fisted, over-the-top acting going on, and you can just really enjoy just the vileness of these characters. And of course, we eventually enjoy getting to see these guys get ripped apart.
If Bub looks a little unappetizing there, though, you ought to see the rest of this movie, because Romero has pulled out all the stops and turned Day of the Dead into a real bloody, gory geek show where things like cannibalism, disembowelment, and evisceration are pretty much routine, everyday sorts of things. The movie alternates those gruesome scenes with a very talkative plot in which the angry military man makes endless threatening speeches against the civilians until eventually, of course, it's free lunchtime for the ghouls.
Yeah, so how do what do you even say about that? He kind of glosses over again the fact that all these great special effects are on display and basically says you're getting too much of a good thing. You're getting so much of a good thing with these great effects that they become rote, that they are, nondescript. It's just an everyday kind of thing. And that's a commentary on our society, especially here today in the digital age where all we have to do is open up Twitter or pick up our phone, another Amber Alert, child abduction. We open up Twitter, bombing overseas. We turn on the news, we click on YouTube. You can't get past the thumbnail headlines, another mass shooting at a school, another mass shooting at a church, another mass shooting at a synagogue, or what have you. It's part of our everyday life, and they're missing that part of the commentary provided by Romero.
I thought this movie was a real disappointment, especially after Dawn of the Dead, which I admired very much. It lacks the high energy and the ruthless anarchy of that earlier movie, and
This is a much more nihilistic film, and it is very dark and very depressing. I know the first time that I watched it, I was just like, man, this film, it's oppressive. It's an experience just to survive it to the end.
It's bogged down in a lot of overacted speech making and
fantastic performances by Joe Pilato. Now, here they're bagging on the speech making. Now, there's a little bit of a behind the scenes story in that Romero's original notion for Day of the Dead was that wars in the future would be fought by zombie armies. So it was originally supposed to feature like battles between these zombie armies, but the budget for the film kept getting cut, so they had to keep changing the concept. Well, now all of a sudden they can't have all these zombie wars, and this was well before the era of CGI. When they're still using practical effects, and you have to go out and literally create all of these things to make it happen on the screen. So part of what they're citing as a weakness was imposed by the studios, suddenly cutting budgets and forcing them to change the actual script.
recycled special effects.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. This is an awful film, actually. I think the Dawn of the Dead was the one set in the shopping center and had a lot of comments on the shopping mall as a very arid, death-like place and kind of creepy.
In this movie, they say all the shopping malls are closed. Right. So we have this one-set movie.
One-set movie in a basement.
Right.
One-set movie in a basement that was forced on them by the studio. So, again, you can't fault Romero. He does his best with what he has. When those things happen, it's either like, well, do I just fold up and we just never make this movie? Or do we push forward and we try to show you what we do have?
It's really exciting. Comment on basements, I suppose. Actually, this film is like a trip to a rendering factory. I mean, or a bad butcher shop. That's all you see is just blood and guts being thrown across the floor of the garage or wherever they shot this picture. And there's really not much more to it. And from the actor's point of view, I would think the actors would be smarter than this. And that is, if you start screaming in the first scene of the movie, you have no place to go.
Nothing left. And also, another thing about the character.
Before I move on too far here, he says there's nothing else to it. There is this kind of snobbish notion among critics and maybe even what we would call normies nowadays that horror films and scary films, that they're like a step up from pornography, if not a step down from pornography, depending on where their particular polls lie. Totally disregarding the notion of beauty and terror, of presenting the horrific, the shadowy side of man as something that it should be studied, but also that can be held up and admired aesthetically at times, like the great tradition of the Grand Guignol Theater, where they had these fabulous, bloody, gory productions. There is a subset of us fans that have always existed, pre-internet, pre-film, that love to see this kind of thing. Everyone is always fascinated by a car crash. You always stop and look to see what is happening when you're driving down the road. Yeah, you know, putting your own self in peril.
The first two movies, we had a lot of sympathy for the surviving human beings.
Yes.
Will they escape the ghouls? Will they hang in there together?
Right.
Will they cooperate? This movie is filled with a lot of nastiness and hostility and anger.
That's true. It is filled with a lot of nastiness and hostility, but not from the lead characters. Sarah is entirely sympathetic. We completely want to see her survive and thrive.
Among the human beings who are fighting with each other while the ghouls just kind of shuffle on and rip their arms apart and shuffle off again, so that there's nobody for us to really get behind.
Nothing, except behind the movie and behind the door of the theater showing the movie.
Okay, so there you go. They were trying to be more glib than to actually approach it on its own merits, disregarding the fact that it has several iconic moments. Here you can see I'm showing on the screen where Sarah has kind of this daydream nightmare sequence where the zombie arms reach out of the wall. That's an iconic sequence, and it's aesthetically pleasing. The image of Bub saluting to me is completely iconic. This is one of the great metaphors and allegories that they completely ignore for this film. The special effects were a complete leap forward. They say it's just repetition of what's come in the past. Yeah, but it's really a refinement of everything that was done in Dawn of the Dead. This film is so gory and so gruesome. And a lot of what you see here, you know, Greg Nicotero and those K&B effects guys, they carried on to the modern day when they created The Walking Dead. I mean, if there was no Day of the Dead, there literally would be no The Walking Dead. We would not have that phenomenon that we experienced over the past decade or what have you. So they completely ignore the aesthetics of it and just the accepting of the beauty of the gore and the terrible beauty itself. Here we see a nice flyer for the Grand Guignol. There you go. Nice and gruesome. Got a severed head, bits of blood. There's always been an audience for this sort of thing. There's always been an audience for it. So that's why, if you are the audience for it, you might actually consider Day of the Dead to be a much better film than the critics thought it was at the time. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see how influential it literally was, how we had this entire movement of The Walking Dead that basically all starts with the germ of the seed of what came together and what was created for Day of the Dead. So there you go. That's my take on it. That's my rewind, my 5-star rewind, whatever we're going to call this, where we take a look back and show you where the critics did not know their a-hole from a hole in the ground when it came to talking about great and classic horror films. I hope you're enjoying your Halloween season out there. Remember, like, comment, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Give me some feedback, a little bit of interaction, and I can guide the channel a little bit more towards what you are looking for. So we'll see you next time right here on Comic-Jutsu.